I am Lindsay Stevens, Assistant Director of Alumni Relations, and thank you for joining us as we kick off the annual Alumni Celebration. We were hoping to be in person this year, but are excited to be able to share a month of activities with everyone. So thank you for joining us at our first one. My colleague Maureen is here with us today as well, and you will see her throughout the month of October. You should all be seeing a slideshow here. We will have a brief moment at the end of each presentation for questions. You can submit those through the Q&A function that you see in the middle of your taskbar. If you have any technical issues or are having difficulty hearing anything, feel free to chat with us so that we can help you resolve that. And then finally, we just ask that everyone is cordial and respectful. And we're really looking forward to a great presentation today. So we are waiting for Dr. Reich to join us. We're having a couple of technical issues, so we are going to move on to Dr. Hoogworth.
Well, thank you, Lindsay and Maureen, and for all of the attendees. This would have been my 50th year as a graduate of the University of Minnesota Medical School, so it's really a seminal year for those of us who graduated in 1971. This is who I am very briefly. I carried a University of Minnesota ID card for 14 years between medical school, residency at Hennepin County, and endocrinology fellowship, and then 4 years on the faculty. During that time, I did 4 years as a general medical officer in the Air Force. After leaving the U, I went to the Cleveland Clinic for 23 years with a practice in diabetes, endocrinology, and metabolism, preventive cardiology, also running some programs, residency and fellowship, and then finished my career in the diabetes business development unit at Eli Lilly. My intent today, if we can go forward, Lindsay, is to do a presentation on quotes. I have been privileged to work with some of the seminal people in the areas of medicine as mentors, as patients, as colleagues. And this really represents my personal tributes to a few of the many mentors I've had over more than a half a century in medicine. Each is a memorable lesson captured in 1 or 2 sentences. I'll give you the backstory. What was the message that I learned? What is a brief background on the source of the quote? There will be 7 different people. What was the context of the quote? Then the quote and what it has meant for me, and what I hope it will mean for others who are clinicians, clinician researchers, clinician scientists. Next slide. First day of medical school. There were important lessons on becoming a well-rounded physician. In addition to Dean Cavert and the associate dean, there was this truly gentleman-looking gentleman by the name of Cecil J. Watson. At the time, I didn't know. He was a hepatologist of some renown, known at the time for the Watson-Schwartz test to screen for porphyria. And he gave us a couple of quotes, and one of which has been, or 2 of which have been seminal in my life. We can go to the quotes. Learn 1 useful bit of information a day, and by the end of your career, you'll be a pretty good physician. And I think, on the first day of medical school, things were daunting. How can I ever learn this? But I've tried to listen to Dr. Watson's advice here and try to learn 1 useful bit of information today. And I've been happy with my career as a clinician. But the other was an important comment about being well-rounded. Always be reading a novel. And I have taken that to heart because we can become so insular in understanding only medicine. But reading novels helps to round us out. So this was an important life lesson on becoming a well-rounded physician. Next slide. My advisor during medical school was Bob Tenbensel. He was a pediatrician. And what I learned from him was, what are the considerations for a medical student who is thinking about becoming a pediatrician? And I didn't go into peds, I went into medicine. But the lessons are still, I think, important. Should give you the background. Bob and his wife had 10 kids. They do all the things that kids do. And he told with humor about his kid eating mothballs and the other sort of things that they did. So he understood children. And here's his quote. Kids may urinate on you, defecate on you, and vomit on you, but never with malice. And I think in the practice of medicine, we have to think about the many things that patients may do in dealing with us and recognize that, like kids, a lot of what they do in force of engagement is never with malice. So it's a balancing sort of way of looking at our patients, whether pediatrics or adults or even geriatrics. Next slide. Probably the most influential mentor I had was Dr. Frederick Getz. And Fred was very thoughtful on tackling difficult clinical problems, and he is seminal in terms of how he dealt with them. He was a diabetologist at the University of Minnesota, and his concept about diabetes derived from the fact that he was a Renaissance person. Fred read widely. He knew a lot about American literature. He played piano, and he was thoughtful about medicine. And his concept of diabetes patients in the 1960s was compared to Oliver Wendell Holmes' poem of the Deacon's One-Horse Shay. The deacon was an itinerant preacher who went around the country with this cart, this shay, and it was made so perfectly that when it collapsed, it fell all at once. And Fred said, this is how we think about people with diabetes, that if they have one serious problem, they really are going to collapse all at once. And he said, yet that's not true. And at the time, kidney transplantation was underway, but was not available to people with diabetes because people said, these people are such catastrophes, they're going to collapse, and it would be a waste of a good kidney. In the 1960s, kidney and pancreas transplantation started at the University of Minnesota, and in no small way because of Fred talking to a fellow by the name of Richard Lillehei, who was one of the typical pretty assertive University of Minnesota surgeons, who said, well, let's not only transplant the kidney, let's fix the metabolic problem. We'll transplant a pancreas at the same time. And those were started in the 60s, and I was a student on the Purple Service, which was John Najarian's transplant service, and took care of one of the people that was in Fred's original paper of these 10 patients. Turns out that the kidney transplants were successful, but the pancreas transplants were not. So pancreas transplantation was restarted in 1981 with Fred and Dr. David Sutherland. And in those first 10 patients during that first year, patient number 1 was a remarkable success. Her graft lasted for 13 years until she died of an accidental death sometime later. The next 9 were catastrophic failures. Lots of bad things happened. Next slide. In that context, I was sort of a brash fellow at the time, brash junior faculty member. I said to Fred, are we like rats in which intermittent positive reinforcement is the strongest reinforcer? If Mary Ellen Barron White had not been such a success, would this program still continue? And I will say this was in the context of lots of internal criticism about the program. Fred's comment was very simple. You weren't here when we started kidneys. Well, I had been as a medical student, but I didn't understand all of the issues. And the real issue that Fred taught me is if it's a difficult problem, and if you believe it's the right thing to do, you have to bear through some of the failures. And if you can go to the next slide, just fast forward, Lindsay. I did it. No, I'm sorry. Just there we go. Thank you. Fred has been so instrumental in terms of kidney and pancreas transplants in people with diabetes that a few years ago, 3 graduates of the University of Minnesota Medical School, David Kendall, Betsy Sequist, and myself, all graduates of the Endocrinology Fellowship Program. We had known Fred continuously between 1978 and 2004 when he retired. Betsy is still the head of endocrinology. And we did a reflection, a profile in diabetes care that talks about the history of how instrumental Fred was in not only kidney and pancreas transplantation, but in other seminal approaches to dealing with diabetes. Next slide. Don Hunninghake taught me a lot about approaches to successful clinical trials and participant retention. I knew when I was in practice at the Cleveland Clinic and knew when I was at Lilly that recruitment and retention are important for the success of a trial, both in terms of assuring efficacy, being able to evaluate safety, and in terms of keeping the costs down. I was involved with Don in the Lipid Research Clinic coronary primary prevention trial, which was the first cholesterol lowering trial to assess the effect on myocardial infarction. Of the 10 centers, Don had not only the most participants, but he had the highest retention from any other academic centers. And I asked him one day, Don, what does it take to be successful? Here was his quote. You can ask participants to do anything except make them wait. As long as people were busy in the clinic, they were happy to continue to participate, but they didn't like waiting when they had committed their time to an important trial. And this is a lesson that I taught my study coordinators over the next couple of decades. Next slide, please. Pete Schumacher recruited me to the Cleveland Clinic. And what I learned from him is approaches to being a successful clinical and research collaboration, and being a clinician researcher, this was useful. Pete was bar none the smartest clinical endocrinologist I have ever met. And that's over a period of more than 50 years. And I have met a lot of smart clinical endocrinologists. And here was his quote. The nice thing about working at the Cleveland Clinic is you do not have to be afraid to say, I don't know. You just need to find a person who might have the answer. And that, I think, is one of the successes of the Cleveland Clinic and large multi-specialty group practices where people collaborate to take good care of patients. And no one is above saying, I'm not quite sure how to deal with this problem. I don't know. Can you help me? Next slide. This is my only patient. And I recognize now that although it occurred in the early 2000s, it's still important today. And it's on the important considerations for racial differences. I was privileged to take care of Carl Stokes, the first Black mayor of a major US city, Cleveland, became a judge and an ambassador to the Seychelles. And I took care of him for about 8 years. I got to know him well. I loved it when Carl was the last person. I always called him Judge Stokes, but when Carl was the last person of the day, he loved to talk about Cleveland. He loved to talk about its politics. He loved to talk about its racial tensions. And in that context, I asked him one day, said, Judge, do you think that I, as your clinician, take care of my Black patients the same way I take care of my white patients? And here was his response. Lindsay, you didn't grow up in the projects. And he did it kindly, but a white kid from rural Minnesota was never going to understand a Black kid from the projects. And for me, this means that we have to make a special effort to understand people, but never having lived in their shoes, it may be difficult. Now, he didn't say this unkindly. If you can go to the next forward. In his book, Promises of Power, I'll let you read the inscription to me in his flyleaf. The last comes from one of my colleagues, an endocrinologist, James Andy Anderson at Eli Lilly. I had known Andy for about 20 years before I joined Lilly because I did a lot of phase 3 trials in diabetes drug development, including a number of insulins, and not just for Lilly, for Novo and Sanofi and Herbst and some of the other companies. When I joined Lilly, I was working on a molecule that was similar to one that Andy was working on, but we had an internal firewall. In other words, because I was in an alliance, that alliance was not allowed to know what was happening on with Lilly's own developmental molecules. So I said to Andy, I said, this is a new situation for me, and the research is different and the publications are different. Give me a bit of advice as a new kid to Lilly. And here was his quote. If you see something that concerns you, speak up. You may not win friends, but you can sleep at night. And I guess this is really relevant in the current COVID era, where there are a number of articles that were published hastily. People were sort of critical, a number of retractions. And Andy was very level-headed to say, do it right. Don't be afraid to speak up if you think it's not as good as it should be. And you don't need friends, but you do need to sleep at night. Next slide. So I close with respect and gratitude and admiration for the 7 mentors quoted here, 6 are now deceased. Andy is the only one who's still alive. And other mentors who have been especially impactful in my career. Jack Oppenheimer, who was chair of endocrinology when I was a fellow. Bernadine Healy, who was chair of research at the Cleveland Clinic before becoming the director of the NIH. And Muz Ahmed, who was the chair of medicine and gave me an opportunity to run a residency program. And each of these people, these 3 are also deceased, have left an impact on my career. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to join this group of, I think, diverse perspectives and all of you that are joining us today. I'm a pediatric hospitalist. I work at Children's in Minnesota and was a graduate of the pediatric residency program after completing medical school at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. My talk today talks a little bit about imagining what medicine could be like if it were a little bit different than it is today. So I invite you to join me. Please stay on the first slide, Lindsay. George Floyd, COVID, racism, turbulence in medicine, physician suicide, gender inequality with pay gaps, oral injury, unequal access to care, care rationing. Each of these has been the subject of the field of medicine, within the field of medicine, in peer-reviewed literature and the popular press over the past 2 years. It seems that our field is drawing ever closer to an edifice and is ripe for change. So today I invite you to join me on an imaginary journey of what if, so stories that have not yet been written, but what could be our future. So next slide. 63% of our patients would like to discuss their cost of care, yet we only have these conversations 15% of the time. Meanwhile, cost of care has been rising steadily, and we ask patients and families to cover approximately 20%. During COVID, it's estimated that these costs are likely in the tens of thousands of dollars, and yet insurance companies have recorded record profits. What if going to the doctor was like taking your pet to the vet? As a patient, you or your family would receive the predicted cost of therapies, outline benefits and alternatives, and risks of treatment with a billing plan at the outset, rather than several weeks or months later. You wouldn't receive layers of billing data with the EOB coming prior to the PC, followed by the facility SOCC and provider charge. You might think twice about that third facility administered dose of acetaminophen that wound up with a summary charge of $25 that might have bought you 5 bottles worth outside of the hospital. You might consider the cost when determining the benefits of quality of life. The choice for rare, expensive, investigational, or technologically advanced treatment might be available only to those participating in a research setting, but then this might lead to early discovery and focused recruitment with dissemination of knowledge. Next slide. What if going to the doctor was like insuring your vehicle? Might additional benefits and discounts be available to you for remembering to rotate your tires? For instance, getting a colonoscopy or a mammogram, wearing your seatbelt, like getting vaccinated, avoiding accidents, checking your diet, exercising at least 60 minutes 4 days a week, knowing your cardiovascular risk factors, or changing your oil. When pooled with others, benefits might be weighed so that all can receive necessary prevention, much like your vehicle receives the result of the airbag or exhaust system recall that might put you at unnecessary risk. Once upon a time, this was the mission of managed care organizations who sought to mitigate risk and provide benefit to the many to promote wellness for the population. Enter the middleman or person, the pharmacy benefit manager, the billing specialist, the administrative assistant to the administrative assistant, and exit the patient. No longer is there a clear benefit for the entire population of drivers, but there is exceptional service and endless customization for the luxury vehicle owner, and merely standard seatbelts for the sedan driver. Next slide. As part of my leadership and educational role at the University of Minnesota Pediatrics Residency, I've had the joy of interviewing incoming medical students and applicants for the pediatric residency. When it comes time for these sessions, I often feel overwhelmed by the number of applications to review and the weight of the task of determining those that might be the best fit for our program, with a relatively limited amount of information and time. At the conclusion, however, I often find that this activity brings me so much joy and feelings of renewal, hearing the words of those that have not yet been ingrained in the task of our imperfect medical system. So what if the practice of medicine reflected the early and idealistic, unfettered views of this undergraduate or early medical student? Each patient would be seen as a learning opportunity, yet also a customer in a family to be treated with the utmost respect and care. Time for care clinical discussions would be limited, yet sufficient for discussions of importance. Clarification of treatment plans would be done in a manner without push to complete innumerable tasks awaiting the ever-busy practitioner. Inboxes would be filled with only the most critical of messages to bring forward your patient's care. And challenging cases might bring together colleagues with adequate time for discovery of answers and collaboration with patients and families. Unjust socialization will not have affected the viewpoint or opinion of physicians, and access to care would remain a right rather than something seen as available for those at ease with insurance plans. I'm curious how many of you present here today are actively practicing medicine. Just the other day, I went into my often neglected physical mailbox in our hospital medicine office and went through its contents. Amongst the educational journals and conference advertisements is a series of letters from various insurance companies. The large majority of these are approvals for care, yet there's a handful of denials. As the admitting provider, I know that the patients who've been denied needed care for one reason or another, and I take these personally, knowing that I've caused a headache for both my institution and the patient and family, likely because I didn't pick a particular diagnosis code or inadvertently shortened my documentation in an effort to facilitate care of other patients who were being admitted to the hospital that day. I wonder why it needs to be this way. Next slide. What if medicine was sacred to those engaged in its practice and not over-speculated, over-regulated, and oversaturated with rules, certifications, and electronic stipulations? What if representation adequately reflected the views and opinions and desires of those actively involved in practice? Might there be a different view of the patient-provider relationship? Documentation would be a product of clinical decision-making and patient partnership, rather than a satisfaction of requirements set forth by lawyers, business people, and managers. Electronic charts may exist solely for communication and execution of the plan of care, rather than click after click to fulfill billing requirements. Patients might see the value of conversation and share engagement in plans deemed appropriate for their needs, protections, and wants. And arguments from those falsely accusing medical practitioners of pushing forth products of pharmaceutical companies, government officials, and medical interlopers might dissolve. Next slide, please. Burnout might burn out and be replaced with the joy and satisfaction promised to those beginning their medical careers on that very day when they donned an unstained, untorn, tailored, and glorified white coat. Next slide, Lindsay. Next slide, please. All of this seems to be an idealistic, utopian view somewhere up in the clouds, and yet I feel the medical field is ripe for change. With burnout at an all-time high, female physician suicide at 1.5 times the age match rate, it seems we're ready. Well, I see all of us here today as potential change makers, and I ask you too to consider, what if? If you're brave enough, ignite the change and ask, why not? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. At this time, we'd like to ask the audience if there are any questions for Dr. King. Any discussion? Okay, well, again, if you think of anything, please feel free to add that to the Q&A, and we can have Dr. King do that at the very, answer those questions at the very end. And so now we will turn to Dr. Reich. Dr. Reich, do you have slides for us or no?
No. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
terrific. Yes, we can.
Okay. So I have the floor?
You do.
I
Please
guess
go
I
ahead.
do. I get no kick from champagne. Mere alcohol doesn't thrill me at all. So tell me, why should it be true that I get a kick out of you? When I was 17 years old and a freshman at the U, I worked at what is basically would be considered an assisted living facility in the southern part of Minneapolis. And you had to have dementia to be in that home. And I would work there weekends. I usually would go there on a Friday and leave on Sunday morning. And there was a woman there, I would call her Betty. She was in her late 80s, and she, I guess now that I'm a physician, realized that she was in the latter stages of dementia. She was basically not speaking. She would sort of never really focus. She just looked past you. It was very hard to engage. One of the things I remember about her was that no one ever came to see her. Nobody ever called to ask about her. And it was very difficult to help her with just her daily tasks. So something like going to the bathroom, she was very stiff from fighting people whenever they tried to help her. So one summer, I think it was in July of that year, I had this idea to bring some music. I brought my CDs, and I thought about what kind of music would they know that I enjoy that they would also enjoy, so we could enjoy it on a Saturday afternoon. And I brought some Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald, that sort of thing. I thought, well, the people here will probably know what that kind of music, and maybe might even enjoy it. And when I put on the music that afternoon, that Saturday afternoon, I had barely left the CD player when I heard this very lovely soprano singing that very song that I just sang in just the most gorgeous voice. Just the diction was perfect, everything. And I turned around and it was her. It was Betty singing the song. It was as if someone had flipped on a switch, turned on the lights. It was incredible. I just couldn't believe it. I looked at her for a few seconds, and then I went to get everybody, oh my goodness, come see what's happening. And we were able to sing more songs. She obviously knew that record. And we were able to engage her with music whenever I needed to help her to transfer. We would dance to Count Basie and things like that. What I did notice was that the effect did not last. So when you stop the music after about 10 minutes or so, certainly no longer than an hour, she would go back to being the way she was before. And then this would happen. So that's what I did the entire time I worked there. And I had no idea, but I had just inadvertently stumbled onto something that has intrigued me ever since, and obviously has intrigued a lot of other people. Because it turns out that when music is encoded in multiple areas of your brain, it tends to have a predilection for the right side of your brain, but it encodes multiple areas, and some of those areas are where your long-term memories are stored. And this is the reason why if you're driving in your car and you turn on the radio and you hear a song that you maybe have heard in the past, it takes you to a particular place and a particular time, and all these memories come with it. Some people say they can even hear and smell and feel, just takes them right back into that scene. Procedural memory, which is the sort of memory that you have when you learn how to do certain things, such as throwing a baseball or riding a bike or singing music or making music or dancing to music tends to stay with you and seems to be really hard to degrade even in people with pretty significant advanced dementia. Whereas things like your explicit memory, as it's called, it's the memory of knowledge, of insight, of judgment. After your short-term memory, those are the things that seem to gradually degrade with dementia. So I had inadvertently done several things that I would later learn were the right things to do. One is I used music that she was familiar with to engage her, that it's more likely to work when people know the kind of music that they're familiar with at sometime in their past. So usually they say go back to about their teens or their early 20s. It's a good time to figure out what kind of music might be helpful. And this is the same sort of technique that is used now in studies to try to engage memories of people who have traumatic brain injuries, such as soldiers that are returning from various wars, or motor vehicle accident type of patients. If they're having problems with amnesia, you can sometimes use music from their past to help them with retrieving some of their memories. In the last 10 years or so, there has been immense interest in dementia and music and dementia. For example, music and lots of different conditions, and I can't go into all the studies here, but music and the management of dementia in particular, behavioral issues, quality of life issues, mental health issues, well-being in general. And there are lots of studies out there. A lot of the initial ones were kind of like the anecdotes that I shared with you. And so those are, people reporting various observations, such as the one I made just now. But there have since been more observational studies, and now we're moving into randomized control trials where we're trying to tease out just what exactly is happening with these patients and how we're able to use music to sort of engage them, to help them manage anxiety, depression, behavior, keep them mobile, for example. And I didn't see any studies when I was reviewing, just trying to update myself before coming here, before 2014, that used any instruments from musical therapy. It's the first time that since 2014, I think we are now using standardized music therapy type of instruments to measure, so you can make an actual comparison. And we're trying to figure out who this is for and who this is not for. The other area that's of intense interest and is in the hospital setting, where I'm not only interested in music, I'm actually also interested in the soundscape. I have had several relatives as patients in the hospital, and it's quite an interesting thing. I work there and I live there all the time, but it's quite an interesting thing to experience it from the perspective of a patient or a family member, which I have been in that situation in the last few years. But music, particularly in the ICU, there's been several studies there. One of the really good ones that I saw back in 2013, it's in the Journal of American Medical Association, was actually from the U, is Dr. Craig Weinert, who is a professor of medicine in the pulmonary critical care division, did this study, and it involved 12 ICUs in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And they were particularly looking at that time, I think it was something like 373 patients. It took them about 6 years to recruit those. And they were looking particularly at use of sedation, anxiety, and things like that. If you've ever been in an ICU setting, and I work in one, and I have been voluntarily intubated in the past, it's a horrible experience to have a tube taking down your throat. You're on your back, usually like this. There's a lot of, and air is forced into your lungs in a way that I cannot describe. It's the most unnatural feeling. And there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of delirium, a lot of trying to manage these patients. And his study was looking particularly at anxiety and pain. I think there was something like a 39% reduction in anxiety and about a 19% reduction in complaints of pain. There's another really nice study that came out of Indiana Health, University Health System that also looked at, in their case, they looked at ICU patients with delirium. And again, there was a nice reduction there, but they had 3 arms where they used personalized music where family members were able to inform what kind of music was chosen, as opposed to, they call it slow tempo music, where the music therapist chose the music. And then in the third case, they call that attention control, which is basically an audiobook. And the people, the thing that surprised me about that study is that the people who were in the slow tempo music, where the music therapist chose the music, were the ones who actually did better. They had the longest number of, or the most number of delirium and coma-free days. And there are many outcomes that were checked from that. Another area of intense research recently with music and medicine is in the area of stroke recovery. It turns out that people who have expressive aphasia, in the past, when I was in med school, they used to call it Broca's aphasia. Basically, it means that your cognition, your understanding is intact, but your expression, your ability to articulate your words is not. Those people benefit from what is called melodic intonation therapy, which is basically a singing therapy. The ones who have strokes that end up with speech that's fluent, but the content is sort of gibberish, tend not to benefit from these kinds of interventions. People with Parkinson's is another area that has been of intense focus, because it turns out that when your brain hears a beat, it can sync to the beat. So a lot of patients with Parkinson's have trouble getting themselves to move. Some of them freeze, some of them have great difficulty. And there's I think there's a really famous video on YouTube that if you search for it, I'm sure you'll find it, of a guy demonstrating this in himself. He's a patient with Parkinson's. And when you play music, so there's a lot of what they call auditory cueing, where we use music you play the cues in their ear, or you use music or a metronome. Either one of those will work. And it tends to help them with their gait quite a bit. And there's a little bit less of the falling, which is particularly problematic in those who tend to freeze with Parkinson's. There's also a lot of depression that tends to travel with these illnesses. In the same vein, a lot of children with autism is also using music therapy. We're also using music therapy in that area, because for whatever reason, when they have trouble speaking, if you sing something back to them, they seem to not have any trouble repeating something that's sung back. They can sing it right back to you. And why it is that someone can have trouble articulating the exact same words that you just said in a speech, but can sing it right back to you is an area of focus as well. There are many others. There's the whole area of wellness and things like that. And of course, end of life care, I've seen quite a bit in music and end of life care, palliative care, hospice. I have a little bit of experience in this area myself. I have had, in the course of my career, 2 patients asked me to sing to them when I basically made them comfort care, and we knew that the end was near. The very first time I got asked this, I don't think that either one of them knew that I could sing, because I don't sing in the hospital. I'm there mostly as a physician. And this 95-year-old, my very first week as a doctor, after I told her that her lung cancer, there was nothing else to do. She was in the hospital. She didn't really have any family. She asked me to sing Amazing Grace to her, and it was all I could do to keep from crying. It was just the most emotional experience, I thought, and moving experience. And after she passed away, a distant cousin of hers brought me a couple of things that she wanted me to have, a couple of candles that she had handmade. And she said, I want you to put these in the freezer, and they're still in my freezer to this day. And then another one was they're sort of like these nesting dolls, but it was a set of boxes, and those are on my desk, and I think about her quite a lot. Another one was, another patient was just 5 years ago, a music teacher, a former music teacher, had heart failure and was dying, was supposed to go to hospice. And so she said, I want you to sing me the Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I said, you know, I know the title of that song, but I don't know I don't actually know the lyrics. I know the melody, but I don't. So we had to look it up on my phone. Her children, her grandchildren were all there, and I held her hand and we sang that song. I thought she was going to last maybe another week. She died about 6 hours after that, so she never even made it to hospice. And my own mother was diagnosed in the summer of 2018 with a really rare form of cancer that even as a physician, I'd never ever heard of. And it was quite aggressive and quite advanced by the time it was found, and there was no real treatment for it. But they were able to buy her some time with conventional therapy. And at the very end, she decided that home hospice was what she wanted. So my siblings and I were able to care for her at home. And of course, my mom taught me most of the music I know. So there was a lot of music involved in those last days. And the weekend before she passed away, she said, I think my time is near. And I need to say, I give you my last blessings and I need to say my goodbyes. And so we all gathered around that Friday morning. And after about 2 hours of her giving last blessings and we telling her goodbye, she slipped into this coma. And the home hospice nurse came by that afternoon and said, oh, it doesn't look like it's long. Maybe before the day is ended, she'll be gone. But she just sort of remained in that unresponsive state. It was even hard to see that she was even breathing. But so on Sunday, I decided on the Sunday afternoon that I was going to sing to her. And I started singing a song that she had taught me. It's one of the earliest memories I have is her teaching me this song. And as soon as I started singing, I could have been halfway through it. And she woke up and she said, you're singing it wrong. It's not supposed to be like that. And I thought, oh, goodness gracious. So, and we sang for 4 hours that afternoon, my mom and my sister and sister-in-law. And then that was the final goodbye. After that, she slipped back into a coma and that was it. And she went away peacefully. But I was quite amazed that I could almost call her back one last time with the sound of music. All of this is just, to me, I think I'm excited about what is happening around music and medicine because it's causing us, I think, to focus on the whole person again. It's so easy, as we've heard from Dr. King, in the fragmented system in which we all work, it's so easy for patients to get caught up in the fragmentation and you're thinking about this disease process and this and that. And there's not a sort of a holistic approach with a lot of these very challenging illnesses like dementia, Parkinson's, things for which we're still looking for cures, but remain quite challenging. And one of the things that excites me about this interest in this time in the intense focus that we're seeing is that it's forcing us to focus on the whole person. The other reason I think it's an exciting time is because I think with neuroscientists involved, we're going to have hopefully a better understanding of how the brain works, because there's certain things that we're seeing that are giving us some insight into how the brain works. In September of 2019, the NIH granted $20 million to this organization called the Sound Health Initiative. And the Sound Health Initiative is an NIH, Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts project that come together. It involves a lot of academic institutions as well, but they brought together music therapists, neuroscientists, all the different people to work on how music engages the brain and what it can tell us about diseases like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, Parkinson's disease, and of course the list is long. And of course there's autism, as well as just normal children brain development and how music informs or the brain in that setting. And so in industry, there's also quite a bit of money being applied in the wellness side of things and in the mental health side of things. And just recently, I haven't heard anything in the form of a study, but I know that there are at least 2 initiatives in New York and London of long haul COVID patients who are learning opera to improve their lung capacity, because a lot of them have a lot of difficulty with their lung capacity after a COVID infection. So I'm looking forward to some of the publications that may come from those endeavors as well. And do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Reich. Excuse me, I'm not certain if you answered this already, but Dr. Gerald Larson asked whether you could comment on Alzheimer's. He says he's aware of families who've been able to connect with loved ones through music, especially favorite old hymns of the church.
Yes.
Have you seen that used in Alzheimer's patients?
Oh, yes. We've seen that used in Alzheimer's. A lot of the facilities, the long-term care facilities here in our area, have programs like that, and we encourage that. And hymns are a good one. Christmas or holiday type music, because so many people know those. Those are also a good one to help families connect with the loved one. And sort of, yes, that is a very common, and it's those kinds of observations that actually ended up leading to the research. Those kinds of experiences with families and the kind of experiences I had that ended up leading to the kind of research that's going on right now.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Reich or Dr. King or Dr. Hoogworth? Yes, thank you for sharing your stories. I think many of us connect to that that piece of wanting to spend time with especially those who are in hospice, and how much music helps with that. All right. I just want to make sure we don't have any other questions here. Let's look in the Q&A. We have a question for Dr. King. How much of the trouble you describe is related to our convoluted financing system, and how can that be fixed? That's from Dr. Jim Hart.
Dr. Hart, that's a great and very challenging question, I would say. There are some proponents out there in a physician organization that's trying to push for a single payer healthcare system, and some groups believe that potentially could be the answer. The corollary to increasing costs has also been that there is increasing middle management, something that I mentioned, both on the hospital side to handle all the claims for insurance companies, as well as on the insurance side, coming up with increasing rules and regulations, and every insurer has their own set of rules and regulations, which makes it so complex in our system. So, I mean, my simplistic answer would be that starting to take away some of that complexity in the billing and payment system would, I think, take us leaps and bounds in terms of cost of care. Because within large healthcare systems too, we have to balance the 50 to 65 cents on the dollar that we get for care of patients that have Medicare and Medicaid to likely the overpayment that happens with private insurers. So I think those combination of things are making things quite challenging for us. I see patients shaking her head. Thanks, Dr. Reich.
Thank you, Dr. King. Any final questions for our panelists, our presenters? Dr. Hugwerf, that I'm sure you saw in the chat, there are several of your class of 1971 classmates here today. I want to thank you all for joining us. We do have events throughout the month of October, including this coming Thursday. Dr. Mary Owen, who is the director of the Center of American Indian and Minority Health, and who is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Biobehavioral Health on the medical school's Duluth campus, will be presenting on Indigenous identity. That's this Thursday at noon Central Time. So you can look at the Alumni Celebration website to see details on that and to register. We're also putting the Zoom links to all the talks on the Alumni Celebration website the day that those are happening. This presentation was recorded, and barring any technical difficulties, we will put that up on the Alumni Celebration website as well. So if you want to share this excellent talk with anyone else, please feel free to do that.
I think, let me go back to my first quote from Dr. Watson. The background from medical school was excellent. It was the traditional training program. First and second years were mostly book learning. We had physical diagnosis the second year. The third and fourth years were clinical. So it was very much dependent on the rotations that you had. But fundamentally, it was the groundwork. And Dr. Watson got it right. You start off in medical school. It's the first time for many of us, you can't possibly know all the information there is. And it becomes, I think the most important thing from medical school was people who said, be aware that what I'm teaching you today may be wrong in 10, 20, or 30 years, and instilling the concept of curiosity. And I had a number of people who were curious and not afraid to tackle difficult problems. That was the other thing. People who took on challenges and said, this is what we think we know, but it may not be right. And so the key thing for medical school is not so much the facts that we learned as understanding critical thinking and the need to keep an open mind. I hope that answers your question. I think Minnesota was great in that regard because we had great colleagues in medical school, but we also had great faculty members who were geared towards stimulating us to think.
Thank you, Dr. Hugwerf. Quick final word on that, Dr. Reich?
Let's see here. Oh, I'm on. Yeah, no, I think he summarized it very well. You know, critical thinking, curiosity. I think for me is a big one. Learning how to ask good questions and being curious will take you a long way, and just learning how to keeping an open mind. And I think before I came to med school, I was a microbiology at the U in the College of Liberal Arts. So I had both of these things, and I think it prepared me also very well before I even got to med school by coming from that perspective and from the perspective of being both in the sciences and in the arts and being able to ask interesting questions and complex questions and just maintain your curiosity and the open mind. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much again. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our presenters, and I hope to see you all later this week on Thursday for Dr. Mary Owen, Indigenous and Identity, and at other events this month during Alumni Celebration. Thank you so much, everyone.